Welcome to the latest episode of the Black Table, Black Star Network. I'm your host, Greg Carr, and today we are, as always, honored to have our guest, but today is a brother that some of us in the community of Black Studies refer to as the GOAT. He is an activist, he's an organizer, he's a social scientist, a cultural worker, an institution builder, a scholar. Today, we are joined at the Black Table by Dr. Abdul Alkalimat. His most recent academic appointment was at the University of Illinois. He has a background in a number of social sciences, the latest of which on his professional title include African American Studies and Libraries and Information Science. And in about 10 seconds, you're going to see why. At the Black Table, we are joined today by Professor Abdul Alkalimat. Welcome, Prof.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Brother, listen, man, we are so happy to have you. And in fact, I'm embarrassed to say that I did not know until reading your 2017 co-written book, The Wall of Respect, that in fact, the name that you came on the planet with, McWhorter, means son of word, which preceded, in fact, you tell the rest. So what does Alkalimat mean?
Well, it's interesting because when I took a position at Atlanta University, really Spelman College, a brother named Kofi Wangara, formerly Harold Lawrence from Detroit, came and worked. And so we worked together. And so he had taught himself Kiswahili and Arabic. And so he translated McWhorter, which means a son of word, into Ibn Alkalimat, Ibn the son of, and Alkalimat, word. Abdul Hakim Ibn Alkalimat. Hakim means, Abdul means servant, and means servant of knowledge, the son of word. That's the translation of my full name. So, once you get that kind of name, you have to sort of then that yanks your collar a little bit. You have to live up to that.
Indeed.
So I've been trying all my life to be respectful of that name.
And long before you received that name, Prof. But I will say, as you write and cover brilliantly in your History of Black Studies, which we'll talk about in a moment, the intellectual arc of African people, of course, is the oldest on the planet. And I think about those scholars of the Western Sudan in Islam and dedicated their lives to the word. And you certainly have. We see behind you a great number of books, and I mistook that for the primary library. Do you mind sharing with our audience at the Black Table where you're sitting and how that relates to the other place I thought you were sitting?
Well, we had created a library of all of the material that I had collected, which really was located in several family homes because I was moving around and I didn't have it all together. So we acquired a old pizza parlor that was not far from our house and built a library there. And then, as time goes on, you want stuff a little bit closer to you. So we have an attached garage to our house here in Urbana. And where you see me sitting now is the transformed garage into a library collection that I have here at home. So I'm really working with two spaces. So I bring the stuff that I'm currently working on here. And as you see over my shoulder, you see some boxes on the wall. Those are my archives that I use to write the book, The History of Black Studies. I'll be moving those to an archive and bringing more boxes in for my next project. But, I'm approaching my 80th birthday in November.
Yes, sir.
And what you discover is that you collect a lot of stuff over the course of a lifetime.
Yes, sir.
And that I could see that applies to you as well, my brother.
Well, models like you and Anderson Thompson and Jacob Carruthers and Conrad Worrell, Larry Obadeli Williams, we could do no less if we are serious about doing what you have done your whole life, which is model the practice of intellectual work. So that's the least we can do, brother. That's the least we can do. In fact, as you were talking there about working at Spelman and then the AUC And you know, I've sat in many circles with elders, with folk who remember those days and remember you getting led out of meetings and busting up meetings and this kind of thing. You know, as we talk about that, maybe could you share with us a little bit of your intellectual journey? Because of course it doesn't begin with you, it begins with your family, long roots in that struggle. And then as it relates to Black studies and that scholar activist work, you really began in many ways at historically Black colleges and universities, huh? So tell us a little bit about your journey.
Well, just to my recent socialization as a young child, I was born in Chicago and the Francis Cabrini projects. And this was a very interesting place because it was a housing subsidy for war workers for World War II. So it was an integrated project, and there were a lot of musicians and intellectuals that lived there. St. Clair Drake lived there.
Amazing.
The backyard that we had hit the next backyard of Ramsey Lewis, Curtis Mayfield, Jerry Butler. That's the environment I grew up in. And I had two aunts. One aunt was a member of the Communist Party in Chicago, and worked with W.Z. Foster in organizing steel workers.
Wow, William Foster.
On the other hand, I had an aunt who had graduated from Fisk, and she's the one that really saved a lot of family genealogical documents. She became an activist in Chicago and worked with Margaret Burroughs in founding the DuSable Museum. And when it opened in Margaret's living room, one of the first exhibits, there were 3 or 4 exhibits, one of the first exhibits was on our family.
Which goes back to, is it Free Frank? I know you and your sister did a book on that. Huh?
Who was born in 1777 and was owned by his father.
My God.
Moved to Kentucky out of South Carolina and was able to hire out. And in hiring out, saved money and bought his wife as the first person he bought out of freedom because she was pregnant and they wanted their next child to be born free. He eventually ended up providing the resources to buy 16 family members out of slavery. So this is the family history I grew up learning. But you know, I'm part of the 60s, so I'm an acorn that rolled away from the tree for a moment. You know, I didn't even like my relatives, you know, because they were concerned about us. They didn't want us to be involved in struggle, etc.
I'm beginning to see the roots of your brilliant dialectic framework, brother.
So, you know, but these two aunts were really very influential. So I have, for example, Eleanor and Otto. Now, my mother's mother was German.
Wow.
And her father was one of the early members of the Communist Party. He worked on the railroad, and he was in the 1920s. He joined the party. So they were, you know, so I had this, both the left and the Black organizing cultural political movement converging, and that's how I grew up. So, you know, it's part of our family history, this struggle, because Free Frank set up an underground railroad station, which is recognized by the National Park Service.
Yes.
So it's part of my DNA. I mean, I've even tried not to be this way. I can't help myself.
You know what? I mean? With all due respect, Bob, I don't have any evidence of that. We just have to take your word for that. So then how did your trajectory then lead you to your undergraduate work and then your graduate work? Because you come back to Chicago, University of Chicago, to finish that PhD. I mean, how did that ensue? How did you move in that direction?
Well, what was interesting is that I hooked up with people who were part of the emerging, really sustaining a focus, an intellectual and cultural focus on the Black experience. So I was able to meet people like Jeff Donaldson, people like Russell Adams,
yes,
who were part of a group called ANICA, the American Negro Emancipation Centennial Authority. And we were the Anikins, the youth group around that. And that's how I met those brothers and sisters. And then I was on the bus and I was going to work at the post office. I'm in college. I'm back home in Chicago.
Yes.
And I'm reading a book by Ashley Montague called The Natural Superiority of Women.
Wow.
Brother taps me on the shoulder and says, I know Ashley Montague. And I turn and it's Conrad Kent Rivers, the poet.
Conrad Rivers, yes.
We go to then, he's on his way to the post office as well. So that summer, he mentors me in reading Black literature. So I'm reading the Harlem Renaissance. I'm reading, Claude McKay. I'm reading the short story writers. I'm reading Paul Laurence Dunbar. I mean, he immerses me. And through him, I meet Hoyt Fuller. And so the three of us are meeting at Hoyt's house. Now, Hoyt's house was full of art, was full of books. And he had these great big glasses, and he had this good scotch. And so we were there having a ball, And out of that came the Chicago Committee of the Arts, and that led to Obasi.
And if it help everybody understand what that organization was about, because we're going to talk about the Wall of Respect in our next segment, but you just previewed it, please.
Yeah. What happened is we were on the telephone. Jeff Donaldson and I were on the telephone, and we came up with Obasi. Oba, meaning royal or chief, so Organization of Black American Culture, Obasi. And so, because I had known Jeff was then teaching high school at Marshall High School, the high school I used to go to. And before he went to Northwestern to do his PhD. So I pulled him into Obasi, and then we pulled in the rest of the people that we knew. And so that was part of the Chicago motion to link art back to the community in search of what we call the Black aesthetic. And part of the issue was the contradiction then was, are we going to make it up, or are we going to observe what Black people are doing? Brother walking down the street having 2 or 3 different plaids on, are you going to accept that as the aesthetic, which is out of the box? You know what I mean? That's not coming from somewhere else. That's coming from right here.
My goodness.
So that was and then it was the musicians who were leaning toward really the experimental chamber music that was based at the University of Chicago. Mm-hmm. But we were also turning them to come to 43rd Street and to play in the blues joints. And so you had that mix of people who were wanting to drink herbal tea and people who wanted to drink hard liquor. There was that dynamic between these generations. That was what was so dynamic about it. People were like learning from each other.
That's a roadmap. That's a roadmap, Prof. In fact, we're going to pause here, and this is actually perfect. That allows us to, when we start up the conversation in a moment again, to lead right into a lot of that movement that you capture in your 2017 book, The Wall of Respect. One of 3 we'll be talking about today at the Black Table with our guest, the activist, social scientist, the scholar warrior, Professor Abdul Alkalimat. Back in a moment with the Black Table.
We're all impacted by the culture, whether we know it or not. From politics to music and entertainment, it's a huge part of our lives, and we're going to talk about it every day right here on The Culture with me, Faraji Muhammad, only on the Black Star Network.
Welcome back to the Black Table. We are in conversation with Dr. Abdul Alkalimat, scholar warrior, activist, cultural worker. And when we paused for break, Prof, you were discussing the journey that led to Obasi, to the cultural formations there, and of course the great Jeff Donaldson and Hoyt Fuller and so many others. In 2017, you published a book, co-authored a book, The Wall of Respect. Could you talk a little bit about how that moment in your life then leads you into your next series of practices? And as you constantly remind us, practice validates theory. So you were helping us work. So how were you all working through that early stage, and then what comes next for you?
Well, I was at the University of Chicago as a graduate student in the Department of Sociology. And, there weren't many Black students around during that period. And what I was finding is that I had as much exposure to new information and educational activities off campus than I had on campus. And so that whole period of Obasi was really an exposure to a tradition that hadn't yet been legitimated in higher education. And so, I would be, just to tell you exactly what it was like at the U of C at that point, there were no Black people around, not even the people who came to clean up, at the end of the business day. And there were these networks. So there was Father Andrew Greeley. He mentored the Catholic students. And there were a couple of people from Reed College. They mentored those people. There was a Jewish dude named Seymour Warkoff. He mentored the Jewish graduate student. I didn't have anybody mentoring me.
Now, help me, Prof, because you literally grew up in the same project, the same area as St. Clair Drake, and he and Horace Caton write Black Metropolis. Where are those Black scholars? You're at the U of C. You're almost pioneering, right? I mean, are they formed in other places with like Roosevelt?
They were working at St. Clair Drake and Lorenzo Turner, the linguist.
Of course.
Working at Roosevelt University. So my experience is there's a commuter train out of Hyde Park that goes downtown. So I go to the platform to get on the train, and there's this brother sitting there in this three-piece suit, with a leather-bound volume on his lap. Being an egoistic graduate student, I say, "Can I see this? Can I look at this book?" And he hands it to me, and I look up at Lorenzo Turner.
Lorenzo Dow Turner, who of course was at Howard, came through Fisk. You end up on faculty at Fisk, and in fact lived not too far from here in Maryland, suburban Maryland. But you literally encountered him on the train platform.
Yeah, and so we then started talking. He started telling me all kinds of anecdotes, and he described the contradiction between his view and E. Franklin Frazier.
Could you help us? Because people might not know, because I guess Frazier may fall on the Melville Herskovitz side.
No, that's exactly the point. He talked about when they were together in Brazil. And so Turner turns to Frazier and his wife and says, "Look, I'm going to a cultural activity tonight. Would you like to join me?"
Oh, I see where this is going.
So they go. And the brothers and sisters get to dancing and singing and playing drums. And Frazier's wife says, "Well, this is nothing new to me.
Wow.
I grew up seeing this." Frazier caught the attitude and left.
No way.
And Dow was laughing, saying, "And he left his wife with me." But,
Now, for folks who may not know the conversation we're having, of course, the great Lorenzo Dow Turner, if you know him at all, probably for Africanisms and the Gullah dialect, but he traveled through so many African communities, collecting, understanding those cultural linkages. And it almost is a Frazier who kind of took the opposite. Well, you Negroes didn't bring anything from Africa. It seemed like maybe he started to see the light near the end of his life. But at that moment, you're hearing firsthand from Lorenzo Dow Turner on how he wasn't quite there yet when they were in Brazil.
Well, the interesting thing is that what Frazier represented was the aspirations of the Black middle class.
Yes.
To prepare us on a bridge into the mainstream.
Yes.
And therefore, mainstream norms had to be accepted as a reality. Yes. And so, but what was so amazing about various encounters that I had, and this includes when I left University of Chicago and went to work at Fisk, and had the kind of intimate connection to people like Aaron Douglas, and others, the connection to the stories that they can tell that help to interpret the knowledge in its human context. And that's what's so important. And any young people listening to this broadcast, I really urge you to spend time with the elders.
Yes.
Just sitting and talking like we're talking now, yes, and hear their stories.
Yes.
And when I say elders, I'm talking about the elders in your family as well.
Yes, sir.
And in your community. That brother who's sitting on a stoop on the corner, he may have something to tell you.
Yes.
If you'll sit and quietly listen. That's happened to me, and I'm hoping it's happening to many young people today.
Can I ask you, Prof? That's very interesting because I was in graduate school, so this would have been the late 80s, early 90s when I and my colleagues who were in Black Studies in graduate school really became aware of your work, along with Brother Ronald Bailey. Could you talk a little about those Nashville years, particularly the People's College? Because, I went out and dug out a few of those editions of Introduction to African-American Studies, but it sounds like the kind of attitude that you grew up in terms of your community, that you began to apprentice in those early academic years, you carried that to Fisk, and then it kind of concretized. Is that because I think about the paradigm of unity? You've always been about, I hate to say history from below, culture from below, because that obviously that's a tired language. But could you talk a little about those Nashville years at Fisk, and then maybe even Atlanta, where the Institute for the Black World emerges, and some of that work grounding your scholarship, your work in the community and with the people?
Well, what's interesting is that there is this sort of contradiction between two tendencies in knowledge production and distribution. One is to increasingly speak to a smaller group of specialists, of scholars who develop a particular language that has meaning for them, and one then seeks approval from that sort of peer group, that audience. But the other tendency is it's sort of like what would be said around Malcolm: make it plain. And so, the whole idea that knowledge is relevant when it is useful and practical for masses of people. And so the tradition of the Black church is very important. And I think that the difference between somebody who can communicate with the masses of people versus somebody who is a theologian speaking only to theologians that are based in universities. I think Woodson writes about that. Mm-hmm. But what we did in People's College is we first discovered that Charles Johnson had created the first People's College.
Yes. And you write about that, of course, in your History of Black Studies book, along with a lot of other HBCU work.
Right. We were talking about how to bring the campus to the community. And so in our context, we wanted to do the same thing, but we wanted to link it specifically to the struggle for social justice. And so students were, and we used to meet on Saturday at the local Y. And it's interesting that we had students from Meharry Medical, we had students from Vanderbilt, we had international students from Iran, and a sister had come from Puerto Rico to study with us and enrolled at Fisk. Wow. This led to the Institute of the Black World, where I had a relationship with Vincent Harding. And so Vincent Harding recruited me from Fisk to Spelman. And we were sort of one of the first think tanks, if you want to use that language, to help to guide the development of Black studies, and recruited many people. And of course, I was part of the insurgency, you could call it, for the origin of Black studies. And so when I taught a course with Harold Lawrence, Kofi Wangara, called Two Continents of African Revolution. And Bernice Regan was a student in the course, and other people. And
all
so
is on. For those of you who know, the founder, Sweet Honey in the Rock, but this is pre all of that. This is around the SNCC years, because you end up in getting involved with Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee.
I was, well, this is before that.
Yes.
I was part of the SNCC organization in Chicago, and I was getting ready to go and actually went to the orientation session for the Mississippi Summer Project. And informant and people told me and reassigned me back to Chicago, where I was the head of SNCC in Chicago. And so that's, but the dynamic of the struggle led us for a confrontation with the existing. So when I had gone to Atlanta initially, I didn't have a place to stay. And so I hooked up with Julian. Julian hooked me up with his father, Horace Mann Bond. So I stayed in the basement of Horace Mann Bond's house.
My goodness. What it strikes me, Prof, among so many other things, is how small these circles are. Yeah. When I think about the fact that you said Julian Bond, then his father, Horace Mann Bond, realizing that his mother's father, I think, was the principal at Pearl High School in Nashville, across the bridge from where you worked. I mean, these intellectual networks are truly remarkable. We're going to pause for a moment here. And when we come back, again, Prof, you built a natural bridge. We want to begin the exploration of one of two books you've put out in the last several months, The History of Black Studies, but you've already built the foundation, that History of Black Studies with 3 sections, that section on community, you've already introduced it. So we're going to pause for a brief moment. And when we come back at the Black Table, we are with Professor Abdul Alkalimat, one of the founders, in fact, of the field, the discipline, the area of Black studies in the academy, which he reminds us did not start in the academy, but in the Black community. Back in a moment with the Black Table.
Don't you think it's time to get wealthy? I'm Deborah Owens, America's Wealth Coach, and my new show on the Black Star Network focuses on the things your financial advisor or bank isn't telling you. So watch Get Wealthy on the Black Star Network.
Folks, Black Star Network is here.
Oh, no punches!
I'm real revolutionary right now.
Support this man, Black Media. He makes sure that our stories are told.
Thank you for being the voice of Black America, Roland.
Stay black. I love y'all.
All momentum we have now, we have to keep this going.
The video looks phenomenal.
See, this difference between Black Star Network and Black-owned media and something like CNN.
You can't be Black-owned media and be scared.
It's time to be smart.
Bring your eyeballs home.
You dig?
We're back at the Black Table. I'm Greg Carr, honored to be your host today on the Black Star Network. We are really honored to have with us today Dr. Abdul Alkalimat, who, when we left, was walking us through some of those early years at HBCUs where he worked and building these community organizations and intellectual formations, and all of that and so much more is contained in this book, The History of Black Studies, just published, Pluto Press, probably in fact should be the foundation book, or certainly one of them, for any African American studies course being taught at this point. Prof, help us understand, because in this book you've got 3 sections, and you, after those first 3 chapters where you talk about the question of origins in Black community, and then you go into the movement history where you just detail so much about these movements, and then finally the academic profession section. I mean, I found that particularly that chapter 14 on theorizing just fascinating. All of the work, though, it's all in one place, reminding us of how astounding it is that one human being could actually narrate this. So I hope this next project you're working on, or at least the one after that, or the one after that, is a memoir. But when as you write this book, could you help us understand why you wrote this book, and maybe continuing your intellectual journey, because it all seems to be moving together as we're having this conversation?
Well, the importance of the book is that it is also generational memory.
Yes.
Those of us who lived through those years experience a lot. I mean, we were moving at warp speed, and is important as our generation reaches our very senior years to have a summation of that. And one of the interesting things about that history is that the movement, that is the actual Black liberation movement, had various tensions and polarities and controversies and polemics that got very serious. I mean, people did in fact get killed in that struggle as we were trying to figure out how to get free. We were not only fighting our enemy, we were fighting each other. And what's important, I think, is that we've evolved to where the ideologies of struggle have been rationalized into theories of Black liberation.
Interesting. Is that, would you consider that an evolution, Prof? Because especially when you write in Dialectics of Liberation, borrowing from Mao, if my memory serves me correctly, the whole notion of fail, fight, fail, fight, fail, fight until victory comes. But you also talk about how a lot of that energy gets siphoned off into these areas that don't connect the vanguard with the masses. And it seems that in the period you're talking about now, that you begin the Black Studies book with, I don't want to make it comparative necessarily, but it seems like y'all were a lot more successful in grounding that struggle in community. I mean, I'm wondering what you think about that compared even to now.
Well, what's interesting is that because of institutional racism, we didn't have a choice.
Right. Oh, you know, it's interesting because I don't know if you've seen Adolph Reed's new book, The South. He's making a similar point. The class contradictions weren't able to emerge and mature because everybody was trapped behind the wall of American apartheid. Is it? I mean, say some more about that. This is fascinating to all of us. It should be anyway.
Well, it's interesting because I had an interesting experience with an economist, Abram Harris, who also comes out of Howard.
Come on now.
University of Chicago.
Spiro and Harris, the Black worker. Hey, y'all, what you're hearing is literally an intellectual history, which he starts the history of Black studies of this work in this country. My goodness, what happened with Abram Harris, Prof?
This was a very, very proper brother.
Yeah.
He was there talking with Friedrich von Hayek and Frank Knight, these economists. And he, had on this tweed suit, et cetera. And so I saw him.
Wait, this is at the University of Chicago?
Yeah.
Because for those who don't know, Harris was one of the cats that they did recruit out of the HBCUs, right? He ended up at the University of Chicago.
One of the first.
Wow. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, please.
And so I walked up to him and said, "Excuse me." And he said, "Do you have an appointment?" And he sent me away. And, and then I was also connecting to John Hope Franklin when he came to the University of Chicago.
Yes. Again, from Howard. Well, no, Brooklyn College, I guess, was the stop.
Right.
But again, the brain drain has started from the HBCUs.
I would carry the man's briefcase or books and walk him home from his office.
My goodness.
My disillusionment was that he wanted to talk to me about his African violet flowers.
Oh, yeah, that was an obsession.
I'm trying to, and so when I left graduate school to go to Mississippi, he counseled me against that and said that he had been invited to be part of being essentially the main consultant to the Freedom Schools.
Yes.
He had been invited to teach a graduate seminar at the University of Maryland on the Reconstruction. Mm-hmm. So it would have been the first time that a Black man had taught white graduate students that course. And that's what he decided to do.
Interesting.
And I'm sitting there in the office, and I walked out of the office. I said, I ain't going back.
Somehow I missed that in the pages of Mirror to America. And every time I sat with John Hope Franklin, I never heard him tell this story. Very interesting.
So, but, and later, of course, I didn't think very highly of the brother at that moment. I've come to really understand, that generation, they were on a mission. And so there was a fulfillment of that mission, just like the word Negro. There are a lot of things that you have to understand a generation in its terms. And
critical. Please say something about, because you find that in your work, you find it in Intro to African American Studies, you find it even as you are narrating in the history of Black Studies, how these these movements in Black Studies precede the formalization of the discipline, but they're coming from folk who are living and trying to figure out that, whether it be Du Bois at Atlanta University, all the things, Charles Johnson at Fisk, they're theorizing in the context of their time and space. How important is that for us to always keep that in mind?
Well, see, today, this whole crisis of Black Studies is whether or not we are clear about audience. In the past, it was a forced thing.
Yes.
Today, it has to become an option. It has to become a necessary responsibility of Black intellectuals to not only be part of a broad universal discourse, but to anchor that in the interaction with the actual thinking and consciousness of Black people.
Interesting.
In other words, Black people know they're being exploited and oppressed.
Yes.
They just don't necessarily think we can get free, so you have to make do, and survive. This has been a long history.
Yes.
And what we have to do is to figure out, how to, make a connection. And that, it seems to me, is a challenge that faces us today.
That's actually in a moment after the break. We take a break in a couple of minutes. When we come back to the latest book you published, which I quite frankly read in one sitting and then went back over and started scribbling in, Dialectics of Liberation. We're going to see how you all just set about just that kind of work in the 60s and 70s and the legacy we have today. I just want to ask you a couple more questions about the history of Black Studies. In that third section, as I said, you start with Black community origins, and then you go through the movements and you narrate many of them. And then since in the dialectics book, you kind of also go back and look at some of those organizations. We can kind of save some of that. But then in part 3, you talk about the academic profession. And as you talk about a crisis in Black studies, I was looking at chapter 14 on theorizing. You say these two trends, Afrocentrism and Black experimentalism. And of course, you do address Black women's studies, queer studies. But are you concerned in terms of a crisis that these conversations have become overly academic and kind of insular and not connected to the community in the ways that you, as a founder of Black Studies, and of course now, and you can also verify for the audience whether or not it's true that the motto of the National Council of Black Studies, academic excellence and social responsibilities, indeed came out of your head, and those who came before you, again, grounding in Black community. Are you concerned that that's something we're losing today in Black Studies?
Oh, I can't agree with you more. We are facing a situation where the connection has been a latent function of Black studies and not a consistent, premeditated, if you will, public connection. And what I mean by that is when a crisis occurs, Katrina, the police killings, the development of Black Lives Matter movements, students rise up
Yes.
And make the connection. Yeah. So Black Studies remains connected, but only in that way. And I think that there are many different examples of how Black Studies could institutionalize the connection. University of Illinois is a land grant institution, and it was set up in order to connect higher education to agriculture and industry. And so there's an interaction. Farmers come on campus, academics go to the farm. And so we think about Black Studies in that same way. The Black community and Black Studies needs to have that kind of interaction. There's labor studies on campus. They have the interaction with the trade union movements. There's business schools. They have an interaction with the business community. And so there has to be this interaction so that ministers should be on campus, and we should have guest lecturers, and we should have teachers. We should have students who are doing service learning. There are these concepts, but we haven't really grabbed these concepts and made them functional in relationship to the actual needs of the Black community. And of course, every Black community has different needs.
Yes.
And so that's where the creative link has to be. This is not to say that young scholars in Black studies should not pursue their own intellectual interests. Of course, that should be the freedom that they should have. But that freedom should not put them into a silo and put them outside of the context of serving the community out of which they come.
Yes, sir.
And so that's really the dynamic. This is not to try to force people to not study or not teach certain things that they want to teach. Yeah. It's that you have to add this as a responsibility.
Hence the academic excellence and social responsibility. Those things work together. Exactly. Well, we're going to devote our last segment on today's Black Table to examining how you lived, participated, and have now written about that attempt, in fact, successful attempt, I would say, to do just that with the African Liberation Support Committee and in that formation in your latest book, Dialectics of Liberation. We'll be back in a moment with the Black Table. Greg Carr, Black Star Network, with our guest, Dr. Abdul Alkalimat, and his latest book, Dialectics of Liberation. Back in a moment.
It's time to be smart.
Roland Martin's doing this every day.
Oh, no punches!
Thank you, Roland Martin, for always giving voice to the issues.
Look for Roland Martin in the whirlwind, to quote Marcus Garvey again.
The video looks phenomenal, so I'm really excited to see it on my big screen.
Support this man, Black media. He makes sure that our stories are told.
See, this difference between Black Star Network and Black-owned media and something like CNN.
I got to defer to the brilliance of Dr. Carr and to the brilliance of the Black Star Network.
I am rolling with Roland all the way.
Honored to be on a show that you own. A Black man owns the show.
Folks, Black Star Network is here.
I'm real revolutionary right now. Roland was amazing on that.
Stay Black. I love y'all.
I can't commend you enough about this platform that you've created for us to be able to share who we are, what we're doing in the world, and the impact that we're having.
Let's be smart. Bring your eyeballs home.
You can't be Black-owned media and be scared. You dig?
Welcome back to the Black Table. I'm Greg Carr, and we are joined today by Dr. Abdul Alkalimat. This is an all too brief introduction to the man, his life, context, the movements he's participated in, and his work. He has been incredibly prolific for the entirety of his life and career, and he has published 3 recent books. And Prof, it's interesting, as you were talking, I was reflecting on the fact that The Wall of Respect came out with Northwestern University Press, and you've done the academic press thing. Then you have the History of Black Studies with Pluto Press, a left press. And then this latest book with our friend Kasahun Chikole, the owner, of course, of Africa World Press, Dialectics of Liberation, you really dig deep into these struggles. As you said, people lost their lives. People fell out. Some of them people still not talking to each other when it comes to this question of class, this question of culture, this question of race, and how those things converge in social movements. Could you lead us through that moment in the late 60s, early 70s with African Liberation Day, African Liberation Support Committee? Help us understand. And as we ended the last segment, you were talking about the responsibility of the academic and intellectual, particularly in Black studies, to make those things work together. Theory, practice informing theory. Help us understand the context of this book, which everybody should get, all of these books, but Dialectics of Liberation, the African Liberation Support Movement, please.
Really, the historic turn of events begins with Malcolm, because Malcolm was the personification of the Black power consciousness, Black consciousness that developed, that was a response to the success and limitation of what was called the Civil Rights Movement, which was always the freedom movement, but the success of the Voter Rights Act and integration generally, increasingly was the path that a middle class was being created by. But the vast majority of Black people were not being included. And so Malcolm represents a transformation of a Garvey tradition, even a Booker T. Washington tradition in some sense, so that Black people as a whole. And of course, part of that motion that was in the US was global. And so when we look to Africa and the development of the African liberation struggles, not only were we talking about the struggle of freedom and facing the police dogs in Birmingham, et cetera, there were the comparable struggles going on in Southern Africa and in Guinea-Bissau. But in addition to that, you had breakthroughs at the elite level, so that the voting led to an increased number of Black Congress people. People in Congress then formed the Black Congressional Caucus, led by Diggs, Congressman Diggs from Detroit.
Yes.
Diggs became chair of the Africa subcommittee of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the House. So you had Black elites in the United States, and you had movement activists all focusing on the struggles that were taking place in Africa.
And trying to build global mass movements. You raised a question in chapter 3, what happens to mass movements when they confront and are confronted by capitalist state power? And you also raised another question: where does anti-imperialism, where does the struggle against imperialism lead? It seems that one of the things that you all do that leads to that African Liberation Day, you really are trying to place this local struggle of Black people in the United States in an international anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist context. And those contradictions began to emerge. How do you keep that coalition together, brother, during that period?
Well, the coalition of the first African Liberation Day, which was organizationally called the African Liberation Day Coordinating Committee, ALDCC, that included people in Congress, leading religious figures, other politicians, academics, etc. After the 72 event, then the conversation began to develop more closely connected to what the African liberation organizations were saying and thinking and doing. That's part of where the anti-imperialist tendency was fueled. It was fueled by what was happening globally, what the global conversation was. And we were talking to people who were involved in those movements. I mean, one of the most significant developments was Amilcar Cabral, a great theoretician of the African liberation struggle, came to the US. And many of us from around the country went to New York to meet with him.
Really?
And there was subsequently a book published about him that the African Information Service, that was Bill Sales and Sam Anderson and the filmmaker Bandera, they published it. And it includes a chapter where it's a transcript of our dialogue with Cabral. And so, you know, we're learning. And of course, we're also learning from Nkrumah.
Yes.
Nkrumah is facing the same kind of CIA manipulation of Ghanaian politics that Lumumba faced in the Congo. Some by the same people.
That's remarkable. I mean, you probably noted the passing a couple of weeks ago of Alice Wyndham.
Oh yeah,
St. Louis, of course, and she talks about them moving over there. She, Maya Angelou, so many others, and seeing that politics up close, and not knowing necessarily how to interact with kind of African politics. But it seems by the time you all got engaged, I mean, you write about the Sixth Pan-African Congress. You tell the hilarious story about arguing over whether or not to say something about Grenada, and Eric Gary gets up and makes fool of himself and renders it moot. I mean, but you all are building these connections in the face of a global capitalist movement that is at the same surveilling you. I mean, there's a lot of walking wounded. The 10th point you make in chapter 5, lessons and legacy, is Black liberation requires respect and healing for movement activists. Could you, in the couple of minutes we have left, maybe even comment on not only the price a lot of those folks paid, but on the contradictions that led to the fracture of that movement? Because I mean, you really do an excellent job in narrating this for those of us who need to have this handbook.
We represented the development of a spontaneous movement that produced cadre. And by the word cadre, what I mean is people who became staff, not just staff of a given organization, but when an organization would transition or would end, you would then migrate and become the staff of something new. Either it's something you joined or something you had to create. And so today you can find people who now have 40, 50, 60 years in the struggle. Those veterans, those elders had been cadre. And one of the interesting things about becoming cadre is that you have battles, and then later you can then reflect back on the previous battles, evaluate them, and readjust.
Yes.
So for example, I came out of Chicago, and so I ended up in tremendous struggle with people like Anderson Thompson,
yes,
and Conrad Worrell, etc.
Yes.
But whenever I saw them, we would embrace.
No question. And they taught us, Prof. I want to say this to you publicly, because you know Jacob Carruthers, Anderson Thompson, those are the cats that trained me. Not only did they have a tremendous amount of respect for you, that's absolutely right. That kind of reflection, it never came down to don't talk to them. Harold Pates, we were just talking about the new book on Black Studies. I saw Harold Pates about a month ago. The exact same thing. That's exactly right. And that's an important lesson for young people when you say today.
Yeah, yeah. And you know, it's really joyful to live beyond those struggles.
Because it was serious business when y'all were living them up.
Hey, look, sometimes I run into somebody and they think yesterday is today. You know, and I have to say, do you know who I am? You know, let's have a conversation. Maybe I share your view.
No question. Prof, I wish, man, look, you know what? Let me just do two final things here. In addition to telling folk to get the history of Black studies, get the Wall of Respect, and to get Dialectics of Liberation, because believe me, we've only scratched the surface. That's one. And number two, in line with those 10 points you make in chapter 5 of Dialectics of Liberation, Lessons and Legacy, lesson 10, Black liberation requires respect and healing for movement activists. Let me say again, not only do we thank you not only for joining us today, but we thank you for your life and work and practice, which goes on. And I know we're just at time, but I must ask you, since you started with this at the beginning, you already working on your next project, huh? Can you share it with us? You gonna make us wait till we see it debut?
In this fall of this year, the next book is The Future of Black Studies.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Okay, so we barely have time then to get the history of Black studies in rotation in our classes, because you got the next clip in the chamber and getting ready to bless us. That's wonderful. What press have you decided on where you want to put it?
The Pluto. So it's a two-volume. It's a two-volume, the history and the future.
Excellent. I should mention this. I know we went over time, but we have to mention this as well, particularly for the next generation who are really adept at this. And I don't know how you did it, because you did a whole book on cyberspace, Black studies and cyberspace. Could you say something about Black studies? Because I know you stay in contact with the world that way.
It's the third section of the new book.
Wonderful. So you all check out, where can folk find you, Prof?
Well, alkalimat.org.
There you go.
The website, and then it's all available there.
It's all available there. You talk about an archive. I mean, I know it's a fraction of the stuff that's in the world, but that is an incredible archive, and you're constantly in contact. Professor Abdul Alkalimat, scholar, activist, theoretician who has validated his theory with practice and continues to do that. We want to thank you for coming to the Black Table, and we want to have you back soon so we can continue this conversation.
Thank you so much.
With pleasure. We're going to clear the table next and set for our next conversation here at the Black Table, Black Star Network. Back in a minute.
Hi, I'm Dr. Jackie Hood Martin, and I have a question for you. Ever feel as if your life is teetering and the weight and pressure of the world is consistently on your shoulders? Well, let me tell you, living a balanced life isn't easy. Join me each Tuesday on Black Star Network for A Balanced Life with Dr. Jackie. We'll laugh together, cry together, pull ourselves together, and cheer each other on. So join me for new shows each Tuesday on Black Star Network, A Balanced Life with Dr. Jackie.
Welcome back to the Black Table. I'm Greg Carr, and we'll clear the table now and reset. But after a session like this, we're not really clearing the table as much as we are preparing to welcome our next guest in our next segment of the Black Table, because what we heard today reminds us that the table is Black. And in fact, out of respect and an acknowledgement of the work of Abdul Alkalimat and his comrades who have given us so many roadmaps and so many lessons, let's end and clear the table with a quote from Malcolm X, El-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, Brother Omar Wali, in his Message to the Grassroots, 1963, where Malcolm says, what you and I need to do is learn to forget our differences. When we come together, we don't come together as Baptists or Methodists. You don't catch hell because you're a Baptist, or you don't catch hell because you're a Methodist. You don't catch hell because you're a Methodist or a Baptist. You don't catch hell because you're a Republican or Democrat. You don't catch hell because you're a Mason or an Elk. And you sure don't catch hell because you're an American. Because if you was an American, you wouldn't catch no hell. No, you catch hell because you are a Black man. And all the men, you're a Black woman. You're a Black person. You catch hell. All of us catch hell for the same reason. Join us next week for our next sit down at the Black Table. I'm Greg Carr, the Black Star Network. Like, share, subscribe. See everyone soon.